If you really want to understand how to tackle big projects with better outcomes, then listen to this quiet, thoughtful man I'm about to interview, Mark Steele. So, we're talking with Mark Steele. He is an extraordinary being with lots of talent in the area of engineering and design, and he can tell you all about his wonderful certifications. But in addition to that, he's an author, and he's written a book, Project Projects on
Projects
Purpose.
on purpose. Right.
So, what do you mean by projects on purpose?
Well, what I really try to do with the title is, put the entire theme of this book into one phrase. And I think I more or less accomplished that because this book really takes my 25 plus years of project management experience, including the analysis of a lot of really bad failed projects along the way, and it combines it with my understanding of systems thinking, particularly the school of thinking from Russ Akoff and his folks at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught for, I think, 40 years or so. And so I've combined those two. And I guess in short, I want to have us re-look at projects and think about them in a way different than we usually think about them. To think about them as a social system and put the emphasis on the organization that is doing the task rather than the traditional project management role where we put the emphasis on the task itself. So by putting the emphasis on the organization or the social system, then we come to the conclusion that the most important thing is making sure that every person, team member, sub-organization, contractor, engineer, whomever involved with the project shares the purpose of the project. So it's deciding what that purpose is and then almost ruthlessly taking that project organization and designing it so it fits that purpose.
Well, don't individuals in the social system that you describe have different purposes? So, for example, doesn't the secretary in the organization have a different role than the guy who's at the helm of the organization?
Well, they definitely have different roles. I mean, if we take a traditional project where you have a designer who might be an architect or an engineer or a combination, and you have a builder who might be a contractor, construction manager, and you have the owner who owns the project. It's kind of the three highest level parts of that type of system. Of course, they have different roles, but if they don't share the goal or the purpose of the project itself, we see over and over again the project fails. They have their own agendas. As soon as there's a problem, they go their own ways. And quite often, in my experience, in my world, that ends up in a court somewhere. Somebody settling for millions of dollars.
So, how do you get people on board? How do you get people to share the purpose and the goal? How do you do that?
Well, there's a variety of ways to do it, but it really is a matter of design. And like I said, it's a matter of focusing the organization, designing this organization from the beginning, and realizing that it includes these different parties that have naturally different roles and even naturally different agendas under a traditional project management model. But redesigning this organization so that they actually subscribe to the same purpose and the same goal. One really high level way to do it, Phyllis, is the way they just did the I-85 project in Atlanta. The I-85 had a fire underneath part of the road. The road collapsed, and they completed this project in record time to rebuild I-85 because it's one of the major corridors around Atlanta. Well, it's my understanding, having talked to some of the folks there, that a couple things came into play. One, they already had a contractor on board to build a different highway project for the state. And they just said, nope, this one's more important. We're moving you to this project. And two, they already ordered a lot of materials and even some of the concrete prefabricated beams and things like that that they needed for a road of this nature for the other project. And they said, nope, we're going to use whatever we have for that other project. We're going to bring it into this project instead, just delay the other project because this one is more important. So they had this clear sense of priority and purpose of finishing this project. Lastly, to be quite frank, they threw money at it, which is something that most project owners can't do on their project. But they basically threw money at this project. Based on their own website, they paid over $3 million in incentives. And it's my understanding they incentivize not only the contractors and the subs working for the contractors, they incentivize individuals on those teams. So if you were the project manager or the superintendent for maybe the concrete sub, it's my understanding you were getting a bonus for every week this project finished early. So, and it was being paid by the state. So they basically threw money at it. And I would argue that if we delved into that project and we looked at their underlying contract structure and the normal way they would have done the other project that they were removed from, it wouldn't have been any different than any other highway project. They didn't really make any fundamental changes to the organizational design. They sort of glossed over it all by providing these incredible incentives to get done with this project early. So that's not really an option open to most owners on most projects. But at a high level, it does show if you can get everybody to work together, you can achieve pretty great things on your project.
That is true. And most government projects are usually delayed, stalled, and over budget. So maybe that they threw money at it, maybe it's money they didn't lose in the long run.
Right. They're kind of known for that, right? Government projects. I mean, it's kind of synonymous with being delayed and over budget. And
right, exactly.
I think some of that comes from with government projects, there's a get approval and we'll get funding later mentality. So the big dig in Boston, I think, was supposed to cost $4 billion and it cost 14 or something.
Yeah, it was ridiculous.
But, it was never going to be built for 4. I mean, really, but they had to get approval for it. So whomever was in the legislature or whatever, or federal DOT, they were going to approve it for. Once there were these holes all over Boston, they weren't going to stop throwing money at it until it was done. So,
well, let's go back into your hypothesis, because it's a very interesting idea that if you get all the people working together, your outcome will be better. But there are also, in every project, there are always obstacles. There are always unforeseen circumstances. How does your idea or your structure work with unforeseen events?
It's actually the only way to deal with them, I would argue. Part of the systems thinking model of an organization is that you build into that organization learning and adaptation mechanisms and processes. And part of it comes from a realization at the beginning of the project that we don't have a crystal ball. I mean, you don't have a crystal ball, I don't think. I know I don't. If either one of us did, we would probably just have won the lottery the other night. We wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation.
Oh, I'd still talk to you, but okay.
Sure, but we wouldn't need to be doing business for sure. So, part of it is this recognition that we don't have a crystal ball, and yet if you look at most traditional project management techniques that are used, they start with this model of we're going to predict what we think will happen, and then we're going to monitor what we think will happen throughout the project, right? And tied into that are all kinds of political things, approval of the board, and often without any other underlying caveats or assumptions that the estimator made. The board sees just the number. Oh, we can do this hospital for $200 million. And there might have been 3 pages of assumptions built into that, but the board doesn't see that. They see we can do it for $200 million. And so they approve it. So there are all sorts of problems like that with this whole prediction and then accomplished model. And one of the examples that I use, Phyllis, is really from outside the world of project management. And I don't know if you're a Jets fan or a Giants fan. I know you're in the New York area. But if somebody at Rutgers went to the head coach of the Giants next month and said, look, I'm a computer whiz kid. I've come up with this wonderful software. And every Friday night we can run this software and it will tell me with 99% certainty exactly how many points your opponents are going to score against you on Sunday. So going into the game, you're playing the Eagles on Sunday, and the Eagles are going to score 17 points against you. So now you know what you have to do to win, right? You've got to score 18 points.
Right, exactly.
In fact, if at any point during the game you get to 18 points, you can be 99% certain you're going to win the game. So here's my question for you. How does that help you win the game?
It doesn't.
It doesn't. It
Yeah.
doesn't actually help you score any points. To win the game, you've got to get the ball in the end zone or through the uprights.
Mm.
And predicting the score doesn't help you. Even keeping score during the game doesn't actually help you to win. You could just play the game and work on getting the ball in the end zone and through the uprights as often as possible. And at the end of the game, they could tell you whether you won or lost. Now, obviously, in a football game, as in a project or in life, there are points in the game where it might be helpful to know, hey, we're at 15 points, which would really be a really strange score, I guess, for a football game. And we know if we kick a field goal, we'll get our 18 points. It would be helpful to know that rather than try for a touchdown, for example. So there are decision points along the way where it's helpful to have that information. But in the big picture, this whole prediction and then keep score model doesn't help you win. And I would argue that it's what philosophers would say is a necessary but not sufficient process.
Let me let
And
me
that it's
slow,
the same,
yeah, let me just slow you up for a second, because
okay?
most projects have this structure that you're describing where, you come up with an estimated budget. That's part of, you have to have the projection on what you think it's going to cost. There are a lot of assumptions built into that, as you say, but that final projection is always expected. What's your alternative structure for discussing the preliminary project at hand?
Right. Well, here's the thing. You're still going to use all those processes. Notice I said that they're necessary but
Okay.
not sufficient.
All right.
But the idea in systems thinking is to look at them differently. So, for example, when you're doing your early estimate and your early schedule, the goal here is not so much to get the right answer. This is the number. We can definitely build this.
Hmm.
It is to get a right answer with clearly defined and transparent and well understood assumptions. And as you progress down through the project, the goal at each step of the way is then to validate or invalidate those assumptions as quickly as possible. So you're not getting 3/4 of the way through the project and realizing that our building, which is mostly made of concrete, relied on a better than industry average concrete productivity. And oh, guess what? We're not getting that. So we're going to be 6 months late.
Hmm.
You know what these assumptions are all the way through. So your goal is not to get necessarily the right answer, although that would be great to do it. Most projects prove that you can't really do that very often. The goal is to get the answer that you think is the best answer, and then to clearly lay out what the assumptions are.
Hmm.
So the assumptions in system thinking are more important than forecast, for example.
Sounds like that would work even in a marriage contract.
I think it would work in a lot of ways. In fact, Russ, who you had the pleasure of interviewing, I think, probably 15 years ago.
Thanks to you, Dr. Akoff,
Um,
was wonderful. Yes.
yeah, I mean, he applied these concepts to organizations for 30 or 40 years. So while it's pretty innovative, and in fact, I haven't seen any place else out there where anybody's applying them to projects specifically, they've been applied to other organizations for 40 years successfully. So these are proven ideas.
There seem to be some market structures or forms that are in the way of what you're talking about. So, for example, it seems to me that the assumptions are not only not transparent, but in many business dealings, you want to not discuss those assumptions. You
Right.
want to make sure that the client sees the shiny light at the end. It seems that there's an incentive to keep the assumptions hidden. So
Sure.
would the
Sure.
market dynamic have to change? Would a client have to say, "Yeah, I want you to build my hospital, but I need to look at these assumptions along the way with you," and do that without risking the contract? I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I think, in my view, clearly this change has to come from the owner. The owner owns the project. They can set it up however they want. And usually they just do it however it's been done before. and they surprisingly or not surprisingly get the results they've gotten before. So yes, there are a lot of uh, obstacles kind of in the way things have been done before in this market. Construction marketplace is not known much for innovation. I saw somewhere, and I'm not sure it's always a fair comparison, but it's one of the few industries where productivity as measured by the Department of Labor has not seen any significant gains really in the last 30 or 40 years.
Really?
And I'm not sure that the way they measure it is completely fair, but it's not a marketplace that's generally been known for innovation. It's kind of dinosaurish, very fragmented market, that sort of thing. So yes, I mean, the owner has to initiate these changes. I mean, they could be suggested by an enlightened contractor or an enlightened architectural engineering firm who comes to the owner and says, hey, we've got this better way of doing things. We'd like to talk to you about it. But the owner's got to really sign off on it. And unfortunately, that's where consultants like me come in, or fortunately, that's where consultants like me come in, because owners typically are at a disadvantage kind of in that triad. Architects and engineers and contractors do construction for a living. That's their core business. A hospital, that's not their core business. And you might have a big chain of hospitals that does a lot of construction every year, and they might have a department that gets pretty good at it. But for the most part, most owners do construction once in a great while. And it's not their core business. And it comes right back to that old idea, right? You don't know what you don't know.
Hmm. So I would see, so your hope is to have your work, Projects on Purpose, help spread this idea to people who are about to do a project or thinking about projects.
Definitely. And I think I try to make it pretty clear in the book even that I'm not trying to tell you that X, Y, and Z, but that's the answer. That's the answer, because every organization is different. Every project is different. The needs are different. What I do try to point out is how does systems thinking apply to projects in general? Based on my experience, what are the principles that would apply to pretty much any project that you could apply to your project? And then I want to leave enough thought-provoking ideas in someone's mind that they go out and say, well, how do we apply this to a project? And where do we go from here? And I would fully expect, as I work with more clients on these types of things, I would fully expect one of my clients to come up with some great innovation that I've never thought of. That'd be awesome. They take these principles, they apply it in a new way to their project, and it's like, wow, this is even a better way than I've ever thought of to do this. But it results from these same seeds, these same ideas.
So much of our history in the United States, for example, has a history of cheap labor in the very beginning stages, unpaid labor, where people could just dominate others and have them build. Uh, what's the best ideal model for workers today? Are unions in the way of what you want, or are they help to what you want? Um,
I think unions would tend to just be another stakeholder in this process. And frankly, in most places in the US, they're not a very significant stakeholder anymore. Um, you know, in fact, we're beginning to have in the US, in a lot of places, the opposite problem now. We have a shortage of skilled workers
mm,
to do the construction trades. And this is something that's been experienced for probably 20 years in some regions. I know of power plant projects, for example, in New Jersey that were going on at the same time with other projects in the same region, and they were competing with each other for electricians and welders and boiler makers and all the different trades that go into making a power plant. So I think we actually have almost the opposite problem now. Skilled labor is actually difficult to find. I know of the Toyota headquarters that was just completed, and they're moving in finally in Plano, Texas. It's I think a $300-400 million project, and they managed to work well on it, and they got skilled labor in a region that's really, really short of skilled construction trades. So it's a problem, and I think it's a problem that's known throughout the industry.
So let's just back up a little bit. Let's take one other application about your work. Very seldom is there a completely new project unless you're building a building on an empty lot. A lot of projects are on top of existing infrastructure. Do you have any magic for dealing with the old infrastructure and the new? Or is there any part of that or any guidance you can give us?
Well, if you've ever renovated an old house, right, you know that surprises are kind of the norm there. So, two things. One, we go back to that assumptions idea. What assumptions are you making going in? Have you properly identified the things you are assuming but don't know? That's where the whole risk management concept comes into play.
Hmm.
Um, and I actually believe that risk management can play a central role in creating a good organization in this model, because with a few minor modifications, risk management becomes a really good learning and adaptation system. So we're looking at the assumptions up front. What don't we know? What if this assumption is wrong? What if we tear up that linoleum in the kitchen and there's no real support? It's all rotted. To take it from a really small project example, right? Then what happens? So having that idea of what are the assumptions and how do those convert to risks?
Hmm.
And then how are we going to learn whether or not our assumptions are valid as early as possible? It's interesting. A lot of people make a lot of assumptions, some of which they don't even realize they're making early in the project. They're just kind of implicit assumptions. If you're doing X, you must have assumed Y, or X is a really bad thing to do. And yet, I talk about these hidden assumptions in my book a little bit. Sometimes Y is a really dumb assumption. And if I asked you directly, Phyllis, did you assume Y? You'd be like, well, no, of course not. So, Phyllis, did you assume that in your 4-year project, all the personnel who started the project would still be there at the end of the project?
Hmm.
You would say, well, no, of course I didn't assume that. People change, people leave, people go on to new jobs, whatever. Okay, so what did you do in your project to record and capture their decisions and their information along the way so that when the people change, you still have access to that information?
Excellent
Well,
question.
well, nothing. Well, we did
Right.
nothing. Okay, well, so you had this hidden assumption that everybody's still going to be here because you're not doing anything about it.
That's an amazingly apt example. Without giving away the whole contents of your book, is there anything you want to add about your focus that we've not talked about?
Wow. I think it's important. Like I said, I tried to write this book in such a way that it would really provoke people who know about projects as well as people who don't, but for purposes of their organization need um, to begin to think about how they do things and how they're going to do things on their project, and really bring that design and systems thinking focus into the project from the beginning. And I think really that's the way forward. Like I said, I try to be fairly explicit in the book that this isn't the way to do it, but if you take these principles and apply them, you'll find the way to do it for your project.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your guidance. You've been a force for clear consulting and advice for years and years, Mark. Thank you
Well,
so
thank you.
much. And I look forward to more conversations. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much.